Alyssa sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the window across the room. It was midnight, and her new house felt strangely unfamiliar despite having moved in weeks ago. The thick, oppressive quiet of the night pressed in from outside. She tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to her like a second skin. She had never liked that window. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. The panes were old, mismatched with the rest of the house, and they rattled even when there was no wind. But it was more than that. At night, it almost felt like someone was watching from the outside. As she reached to switch off the lamp on her nightstand, she heard it a faint whisper. She froze, her fingers hovering over the lamp switch. She listened, but the whispering stopped. Shaking her head, she convinced herself it was her imagination. It had been a long day at work, and the stress was getting to her. She switched off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The whisper came again. This time, it was louder, clearer. Alyssa sat bolt upright, her heart racing. The voice was too faint to understand, but it was unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from the window. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear the words, but they remained just beyond comprehension. She looked toward the window, but through the darkness, she could only see her own faint reflection in the glass. The whispering continued, a soft susurration, like many voices overlapping in secret conversation. Alyssa's skin prickled. She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight to illuminate the room. Nothing was out of place, but the whispering persisted. Louder now, urgent. It seemed to be drawing her toward the window. Her curiosity overpowered her fear. Slowly, she rose from the bed and approached the window. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though the words still didn't make sense. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the cold glass. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. Alyssa let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. For a moment, she felt foolish. The fear had all been in her head. There was nothing outside the window, nothing to be afraid of. And then she saw a ... in the reflection of the glass. Something moved behind her. A dark shadow, faint but unmistakable. Her breath caught as her eyes widened, her body frozen in place. The shadow was not her own, and it was standing right behind her. She whipped around, but the room was empty. Her heart pounded in her chest. She frantically shined her phone's light around the room, searching for the source of the shadow. Nothing, but her instinct screamed at her that she wasn't alone. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching her every move, and then she heard it again this time, from inside the room, the whispering. Alyssa backed away toward the door, but the voices followed her, growing louder, closer. It was no longer coming from the window, but from the walls, from the very air around her. She reached for the door handle, her hands shaking, but as she did, the whispering stopped, complete silence. Alyssa stood there, trembling, her hand on the door. She waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. No more whispers, no shadows. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had all been in her head after all. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the whispering returned deafening, angry, all around her. She screamed, stumbling back into the room. The voices grew louder, swirling in a chaotic storm of sound. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The whispering seemed to pierce through her skull, each word like a knife scraping against her mind. In a panic, she lunged for the window, her only way out. She fumbled with the latch, her hands trembling, but the window wouldn't budge. The whispering was overwhelming now, a cacophony of voices that drowned out her own thoughts. She pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but no one could hear her. No one was coming. The whispers grew louder still, and in their rising tide, she finally understood they weren't just whispers. They were words. Let us in. The last thing Alyssa saw before the glass shattered was a face twisted, pale, and grinning, staring back at her from the darkness outside. Mia had always been fond of old things, antiques, vintage trinkets, forgotten heirlooms. Her apartment was filled with relics from the past: a dusty grandfather clock, a wrought iron bed frame, and shelves lined with porcelain dolls that stared blankly into the distance. She found beauty in their age, in the stories they might hold. One afternoon, while browsing a flea market on the outskirts of town, she came across a stall she had never seen before. Tucked between booths selling homemade jams and knitted scarves, it stood out with its worn wooden crates, each filled with strange, old curiosities. The vendor, a frail old man with milky eyes, smiled at her as she approached. "Looking for something special, miss?" he asked, his voice dry and crackling like autumn leaves. Mia gave a polite smile, her eyes scanning the array of items. That's when she saw it. Buried beneath a pile of yellowed books and tarnished brass trinkets was a doll, unlike any she had seen before. It was small, with a cracked porcelain face and a dress that might have once been white, but had long since faded to a dirty gray. Its eyes were large, dark, and lifeless, framed by delicate lashes, and its mouth was painted in a soft, unsettling smile. "How much for the doll?" Mia asked, picking it up carefully. The old man's smile faltered. "That one? You don't want that one, miss." Mia frowned. "Why not?" "Bad history. Cursed, some say." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's been returned more times than I can count." Mia chuckled softly. She didn't believe in curses or superstitions. "I'll take it." The old man hesitated for a moment, then sighed and named a price. Mia handed him the cash and left the market, the doll tucked carefully under her arm. Back at her apartment, she placed the doll on a shelf, right in the middle of her collection. It stood out among the others, with its eerie expression and dark eyes that seemed to follow her around the room. Mia didn't mind. In fact, she found it fascinating. That night, as she settled into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt colder than usual, and the faintest sound of tapping echoed in the dark. She rolled over, trying to ignore it, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the shelf. Mia sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The dolls sat exactly where she had left them, motionless. But the sound continued. She got out of bed, creeping toward the shelf, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the doll, the new one. Its eyes seemed darker than before, its smile more twisted. The tapping stopped. Mia shook her head, blaming her overactive imagination. She turned back toward her bed, but froze as a faint whisper drifted through the room. Her skin prickled with cold dread. She strained to hear, her heart hammering in her chest, but the whisper was so soft she couldn't make out the words. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaky. Silence. The next morning, Mia convinced herself it had been a bad dream. She got ready for work, glancing briefly at the doll, which sat perfectly still on the shelf. Nothing had changed. She brushed off the unease and went about her day. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. Each night, the tapping returned, always starting softly and growing louder until it was impossible to ignore. The whispering followed, faint at first, then escalating into what sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once. Each time she approached the doll, the noises would stop, leaving her in suffocating silence. By the fourth night, Mia was on edge, her nerves frayed. Sleep eluded her, and every shadow seemed to crawl with unseen eyes. She considered getting rid of the doll, but something stopped her every time. It felt like the doll didn't want to leave, like it had a hold on her. That night, the tapping started again, louder than ever before. Mia shot up from her bed, her heart racing. She marched to the shelf, grabbing the doll in frustration. "What do you want?" she hissed, shaking it, the doll's head lolled to the side, its glassy eyes staring into hers. And then, for the first time, she heard it clearly. A single voice, soft and childlike, whispering from the doll's cracked lips. "Let me out." Mia's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, dropping the doll to the floor. It hit the wood with a dull thud, but it didn't break. Instead, it rolled onto its back, staring up at her with that unnerving smile. Suddenly, the room grew ice cold. The whispering returned, louder, filling the air like a swarm of bees. The doll's eyes flicked toward her, and its mouth opened wider to wide, as if it were silently screaming. Terrified, Mia grabbed a blanket and threw it over the doll, but the whispering persisted, growing louder and more frantic. The air around her seemed to pulse with unseen energy. Desperate, she picked up the doll again, its body cold as ice. She ran to the window and threw it open, tossing the doll outside with all her strength. For a moment, everything was still. Then the whispering stopped. Mia collapsed on her bed, shaking, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't sleep that night, but when morning came, she finally ventured outside. The doll was gone, but when she returned to her apartment, her blood ran cold. Sitting on the shelf, in its usual spot, was the doll, staring back at her with that same twisted smile. When Tyler first moved into his new apartment, he didn't expect much. It was small, cheap, and in an older building on the outskirts of town. But for someone just starting his first job, it was perfect. The rent was low, and the landlord seemed eager to get someone in quickly. Tyler didn't ask too many questions. He just signed the lease and moved in. The apartment was nothing special: white walls, creaky floors, and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 70s. But there was one strange feature he couldn't stop thinking about. At the end of the hallway was a door, plain and unremarkable. Yet, no lights which could illuminate the room beyond it. The landlord had mentioned it in passing. "That room doesn't have a light," he'd said, almost offhandedly. "It's been like that since I bought the place." Tyler didn't think much of it at the time. There were plenty of strange quirks in old buildings. It was probably just a wiring issue, and since it was a small storage room, he didn't care enough to press further. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful. Tyler spent his evenings unpacking boxes, getting settled in. But no matter what he did, the door at the end of the hallway was always in the corner of his eye. Something about it bothered him: how dark it was inside, how the door never seemed fully closed, leaving just a sliver of blackness visible through the crack. On the fourth night, curiosity got the better of him. Tyler grabbed a flashlight, deciding to finally investigate the room. It was probably just filled with junk left behind by previous tenants. Nothing to worry about. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the hinge groaning as though it hadn't been moved in years. He clicked on the flashlight and shined it inside. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing a small, empty room. There were no windows, no furniture, nothing but bare walls and a dusty floor, except for one thing. In the far corner of the room, the flashlight caught something: a small, dark object. Tyler frowned and stepped inside, shining the light more directly on it. It was an old leather-bound book, sitting alone in the middle of the otherwise empty room. He knelt down, picking it up. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. There was no title, no markings to indicate what it was. Tyler flipped it open, thumbing through the pages, but they were all blank. That was odd. He shrugged, deciding it wasn't important. Maybe someone had left it there years ago. He placed the book back where he'd found it and turned to leave. But as he reached the doorway, something strange happened. The flashlight flickered. Tyler stopped, tapping the side of the flashlight to steady the beam. For a moment, it worked, and he sighed in relief. But then the light went out completely, plunging the room into complete darkness. His breath caught in his throat. The room was unnaturally dark, the kind of pitch black that felt thick, oppressive. He reached for the door, but as his fingers brushed against the wood, he realized something horrifying. The door was no longer there. His hands pressed against a solid wall where the door had just been moments before. Panic surged through him. He turned, feeling along the walls, trying to find any sign of an exit, but the walls were smooth, featureless. There was no door. He was trapped. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for his phone, praying that the screen's light would help him. But as he pulled it from his pocket, the screen flickered on for a second before dying. Suddenly, the darkness felt alive. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. Tyler froze, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something was moving toward him in the darkness. He backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, pressing him toward the center of the room, and then he heard it a whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from all around him, a low murmur of voices speaking in unison, though he couldn't make out the words. The whispers grew louder, swirling in the air, filling the room until they drowned out his thoughts. The sound was maddening, like 100 voices talking at once. Tyler pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was useless. The whispers were inside his head now, crawling through his mind like a swarm of insects. He dropped to his knees, shaking, his eyes wide as he stared into the impenetrable blackness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. Tyler sat there, trembling, his heart racing in his chest. The room felt colder now, the air thick and heavy. He tried to move, to stand, but his body refused to obey. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong, in the corner of his eye. He saw movement, a figure, just barely visible in the darkness, standing where the book had been. It was tall, its shape distorted by the shadows, but its eyes, those were unmistakable. They gleamed in the dark, two pinpricks of light in an ocean of black. Tyler tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate. The whispers returned, soft and insistent, filling the air as the figure loomed over him, and then, in a voice that wasn't his own, Tyler spoke. "You shouldn't have come in here." The lights in the apartment flickered back on, and the door was there again. The room was empty, as it had been before, but Tyler wasn't the same. He never was again. The air was crisp as Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Ben gathered around the campfire, their laughter carrying through the cool forest air. They had hiked all day to get to this remote campsite deep in the woods, far from the world, from their phones, and from their problems. The stars above were brilliant, the fire crackled warmly, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. "This was a great idea," Emily said, sipping from her mug of hot chocolate. "Yeah, we all needed a break," Jake replied, leaning back against a log. Ben grinned, poking at the fire with a stick. "Well, if we're out here, we might as well tell some scary stories, right? We're in the middle of nowhere. It's dark, the perfect setting." Sarah groaned. "Seriously, Ben?" You always do this. You know I'm terrible with scary stories. Come on, just one. Ben teased. I promise it won't be too bad, Jake chuckled. All right, I'll go first then. Something light for Sarah's sake. He cleared his throat, the flames dancing in his eyes. Have you guys ever heard of the Pine Hollow Phantom? The others shook their heads. Jake's voice dropped low as he continued. Legend has it, these woods were once the home of a man, an old hermit who lived alone, far from town. They say he was disturbed. He hated people, hated civilization, and over time, he started losing his mind. He would roam the woods at night, muttering to himself, and sometimes he'd follow hikers, watching them from the shadows. Emily shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her. Jake leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper now. One night, a group of campers like us set up here. They had no idea the hermit was watching them, stalking them. And one by one, they started disappearing. First, a guy went to fetch water and never came back. Then, one of the girls went to the restroom and vanished too. The others thought it was a joke, a prank, until only one person was left. The hermit grabbed him by the neck and dragged him into the forest, his screams echoing through the night. Jake leaned back, grinning. And they say, the Pine Hollow Phantom still roams these woods, hunting for more victims. Maybe tonight, he's watching us. Sarah rolled her eyes. Okay, that was pretty lame. Ben laughed. It wasn't that bad. Could use more gore, though. Emily, however, wasn't laughing. She glanced over her shoulder, the dark trees looming just beyond the firelight. That's not real, right? There's no phantom in these woods. Jake shrugged with a smirk. Who knows? These woods are old. People have disappeared out here before. No one really knows what's out there. As they joked, a sudden snap of a twig echoed from the darkness beyond their camp. The group went quiet, their heads turning toward the sound. Did you guys hear that? Emily whispered. Her eyes wide, Ben stood up, squinting into the trees. Probably just a deer or something, but the atmosphere had changed. The fire seemed dimmer, the shadows longer. The sound of rustling leaves echoed again, this time from the other side of their camp. Jake stood up, his expression no longer amused. Okay, who's messing with us? Nobody's out here but us, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Suddenly, from the edge of the clearing, something darted between the trees, a shadow, quick and silent. Emily gasped, pointing. There. Did you see that? Ben grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only thick underbrush. There's nothing there. Relax, you're just spooked from the story. But Emily wasn't convinced. She pulled her blanket tighter around her, her heart pounding in her chest. No, I saw something. Something. Watching us, Ben rolled his eyes. You guys are just freaked out. It's probably some animal. Suddenly, there was another crack, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Everyone froze. Jake's flashlight flicked on, scanning the trees. Okay, that was definitely something. The footsteps continued, moving closer, circling their camp. The fire seemed to flicker and dim, the warmth draining from the air. Jake, gripping his flashlight tightly, took a step forward. Who's there? Double quotes ... no answer. Ben, ever the skeptic, sighed. It's probably some idiot messing with us. He picked up a rock and hurled it into the darkness. Go away. You're not scaring us. But the footsteps didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder, heavier, and now it was clear they were coming from all sides. The group huddled closer together, their eyes darting around the campsite. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was deathly silent. The fire crackled softly, and the only sound was the ragged breathing. Emily reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to turn on the flashlight. But just as she did, the flames of the campfire were snuffed out, plunging them into darkness. Panic erupted. "Turn it back on," Jake shouted, but no one could move from the blackness. A deep guttural whisper echoed through the trees. It was a voice, low and unintelligible, but unmistakably human, or what used to be human. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, until it felt like the very forest was speaking. Suddenly, Emily screamed. In the faint light of her phone, they saw a figure tall, shadowy, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Its eyes gleamed, reflecting the weak glow of the phone. It didn't move, but they all knew it was watching them. "Run!" Jake yelled, and they all bolted into the woods, their hearts racing, the figure behind them fading into the night. But the whispering followed them, closer now, almost beside them, as they ran deeper into the forest. The last thing they heard before everything went silent was a single echoing laugh. Cameron had always hated the drive to his grandparents' old farmhouse. The long, winding road stretched through miles of nothing but cornfields and open sky, making the world feel vast and empty. Every summer, his parents sent him to spend a week at the farm, a tradition he never quite understood. His grandparents were kind enough, but the isolation and the eerie quiet of the place always set him on edge. This summer, however, was different. He was older now, nearly 17, and his sense of dread had grown stronger with each visit. The fields, once filled with the sound of rustling cornstalks, now felt oppressive. The wind that used to whistle through the house's creaky windows now seemed to carry whispers. Something was wrong, though Cameron couldn't put his finger on what. The first few days of his visit were uneventful, filled with the usual chores and small talk with his grandparents. They were old and a little strange, but harmless. They spent most of their days tending to the farm, while Cameron wandered aimlessly around the house or ventured out to the edge of the property. On the third evening, as the sun began to set, his grandmother asked him to fetch some vegetables from the garden near the edge of the cornfield. It wasn't far, but by the time he made it out there, the sky had turned a deep purple, and the shadows of the cornstalks stretched out like fingers across the earth. As he gathered the vegetables, he heard a faint rustling, far too deliberate to be the wind. Cameron froze, glancing toward the field. The corn swayed, but there was no breeze. The stalks were too tall to see through, but he could sense something beyond them. He squinted into the growing darkness, waiting for another sound. And then he saw it, a figure, standing just within the rows of corn. It was barely visible, but its outline was clear enough, tall, thin, and unmoving. It was standing perfectly still, just a few feet away from where the garden ended and the field began. Cameron's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, but it didn't move. He felt a sudden irrational surge of fear. It wasn't his grandfather, it wasn't anyone he knew. Cameron turned quickly, gathering the vegetables and rushing back to the house. His heart pounded in his chest, the cool evening air biting at his neck as he hurried through the back door. His grandmother smiled warmly at him from the kitchen. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice soft and steady. "Did you get everything?" Cameron nodded, still shaken. He didn't mention the figure. Maybe it was just his imagination, he told himself. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. That night, Cameron couldn't sleep. The house creaked and groaned as it always did, but tonight The noises felt different, more like something moving through the walls, rather than just the house settling. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying the image of the figure in the field, standing so still, so unnaturally still. Around midnight, he heard it again, a rustling, soft but distinct, outside his window. Cameron sat up, his heart racing. His bedroom overlooked the field, and from his bed, he could just barely make out the tops of the cornstalks swaying in the moonlight. The rustling continued, and with it, the faintest sound of footsteps crunching on dry earth. He crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. There, at the edge of the field, was the figure again. This time, it was closer, standing just beyond the fence that separated the house from the cornfield. Its head was tilted, as though it were watching him. In the dim light, Cameron could barely make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A tall, thin figure, too tall to be a person, too still to be anything natural. Cameron's skin crawled as he slowly backed away from the window. He considered waking his grandparents, but something told him they wouldn't believe him. Maybe they wouldn't even care. They had lived here for decades after all, and never once mentioned anything strange about the fields. Maybe they knew something he didn't. The next morning, Cameron tried to push the memory of the figure out of his mind. He busied himself with chores, staying as far from the cornfield as possible. But as the day wore on, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. The whispers on the wind seemed more insistent, more directed that evening. As the sun dipped low in the sky, his grandfather called him over. "I need you to help me fix the fence at the edge of the field," he said, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. Cameron hesitated. "Can't we do it tomorrow? It's getting late." His grandfather shook his head. "It's got to be done today, boy." Reluctantly, Cameron followed him out to the field. The sun was nearly gone by the time they reached the fence, and the long shadows of the cornstalks stretched out toward them, like hands reaching for something unseen. As his grandfather worked, Cameron couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His eyes darted toward the field, expecting to see the figure again. But this time, there was nothing. Just rows of corn swaying gently in the breeze. Suddenly, his grandfather spoke, his voice low and grim. "There's something you should know about this place, Cameron." Cameron's heart skipped a beat. He turned to his grandfather, who was staring out at the field, his face unreadable. "That thing you've been seeing," his voice trailed off, and for a moment there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the corn. "It's been here for a long time. It watches. It waits. But it's never come this close before." Cameron's blood ran cold. "What? What is it?" His grandfather didn't answer. Instead, he straightened up, his eyes fixed on something deep within the field. "Get inside, boy. Now." Cameron turned, and there it was standing in the field, closer than ever before. It was no longer just a figure. Now he could see its face, or what passed for a face. Pale, hollow eyes stared at him from the darkness, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. Cameron ran, the whispers growing louder behind him, but he didn't dare look back. That was the last time he ever set foot near the field. When Lucy and her friends booked a weekend getaway at the historic Holloway Hotel, they expected a charming retreat in the picturesque countryside. The hotel was known for its old-world elegance and its stories of grandeur from a bygone era. It was the perfect escape from their busy lives. The first night at the hotel was delightful. The lobby was grand, with polished marble floors and antique chandeliers. Their room, though dated, had a certain vintage charm. The beds were comfortable, and the view of the sprawling gardens from their window was beautiful. But on the second night, something unusual happened. After a long day of exploring the local sights, their friends Lucy, Tom, Rachel, and Mark returned to the hotel exhausted. They gathered in the common room, chatting about their plans for the next day. It was then that the hotel manager, a stern-looking man named Mr. Holloway, approached them. "I trust you're enjoying your stay?" Mr. Holloway asked. "Yes, very much," Lucy replied, smiling. "The place is beautiful. Mr. Holloway's gaze lingered on them, and he nodded slowly. "That's good to hear. Just a word of caution, our hotel has a few quirks. If you notice anything odd, don't be alarmed. It's part of the hotel's unique history." The friends exchanged amused glances. "Thanks for the warning," Mark said, chuckling. Later that evening, they retired to their room 217. Exhausted, they fell asleep quickly. But around midnight, Lucy woke with a start. The room was eerily quiet. She sat up, her heart racing, and looked around. Something felt wrong. The first thing she noticed was that the layout of the room had changed. The bed, which had been against one wall, was now positioned in the center of the room. The antique dresser was missing, replaced by a tall, ornate wardrobe she was sure hadn't been there before. Lucy got out of bed and wandered to the door, only to find it locked from the inside. She tried the handle repeatedly, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and she pounded on the door, calling out to her friends, Tom, Rachel, Mark, "Wake up." There was no response. The room was completely silent. Lucy's mind raced. She felt trapped in a maze of her own making. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but it was dead, despite having been fully charged earlier. As she turned back toward the room, she noticed something even more disturbing. The wallpaper, which had been a faded floral pattern, was now covered in strange, cryptic symbols. They seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. Lucy's breath came in ragged gasps. She approached the window, but it was sealed shut. The moonlight that had illuminated the room was gone, replaced by an unnatural darkness. The view outside was obscured by a thick black fog. A figure emerged from the shadows within the wardrobe. It was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes locking onto Lucy's with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Who are you? What do you want?" Lucy demanded, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he simply extended a long, bony hand toward her. Lucy backed away, stumbling over the furniture. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, and the furniture started moving on its own. The symbols on the wallpaper glowed brighter, casting eerie shadows that danced around the room. Panicked, Lucy turned toward the wardrobe, but the man had vanished. In his place was a swirling vortex of darkness, pulling everything toward it. The room spun around her, and she felt herself being drawn toward the void. Just as she was about to be consumed by the darkness, she heard a loud crash. The door to the room burst open, and Tom, Rachel, and Mark rushed in. Their faces were pale with fear. "Lucy," Tom shouted. "We couldn't get the door open. Are you okay?" The room snapped back into place, the vortex disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The wardrobe was just a wardrobe again, and the cryptic symbols had vanished. The window was back to normal, and the moonlight streamed in. Lucy collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. Her friends rushed to her side, their faces filled with concern. "What happened?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Lucy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The room. It changed. There was something in the wardrobe." Mark glanced around the room, his face pale. "This is seriously messed up." They left the room, vowing to speak with Mr. Holloway about what had happened. When they reached the lobby, Mr. Holloway was waiting for them, a somber expression on his face. "I see you've encountered one of the hotel's quirks," he said softly. "The room has its own way of reacting to those who stay in it. It's part of the hotel's history, though I'm afraid it's not something we can easily explain." The friends checked out early, their weekend ruined by the haunting experience. As they left the Holloway Hotel, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. The hotel stood in silence, its secrets hidden behind its elegant facade, waiting for the next unsuspecting guests. Deep in the outskirts of the old industrial town, hidden behind dense overgrowth and the ruins of a forgotten era, stood the Forsyth Asylum. The building had been abandoned for decades, its walls crumbling and windows shattered. Locals spoke of it only in hushed tones, spinning tales of its grim past and the restless spirit said to haunt its halls. Curiosity had always drawn Jake and his friends Emily, Sam, and Laura to explore the abandoned places around town. They were amateur urban explorers, fascinated by the history and the thrill of the unknown. When they heard about the Forsyth Asylum, they knew they had to check it out. The day of their visit was gray and overcast, fitting the mood of the asylum perfectly. They arrived in the late afternoon, their breaths visible in the chilly air. The building loomed ahead, its once grand facade now a mere skeleton of broken bricks and twisted metal. Jake, the unofficial leader of their group, led the way as they entered through a gaping hole in the wall. The inside of the asylum was as desolate as they had imagined. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the air was thick with dust and decay. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant sound of dripping water. They wandered through the hallways, each room telling its own story of abandonment. Old medical equipment rusted away in darkened corners, and faded patient records lay strewn about. The asylum's history was evident in the peeling paint and the unsettling atmosphere. As they explored, Emily found an old ledger in what appeared to be an office. "Look at this," she said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "It's like a record of the patients who were here." Sam peered over her shoulder. "What's that name there?" "Margaret Sullivan." Emily nodded. "Yeah, she was listed as a long-term patient. There are some notes here about her condition. It sounds like she was treated very poorly." Laura shuddered. "This place gives me the creeps. Let's move on." They continued their exploration, reaching the asylum's former psychiatric ward. The rooms were smaller here, lined with rusting bed frames and cracked tiles. There was a distinct sense of foreboding, a feeling that they were not alone. Jake, always the thrill-seeker, suggested they investigate the basement. "Come on, it'll be fun. There's probably some old equipment down there or something." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They descended the creaky staircase into the darkness. The basement was colder, the air damp and musty. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. They used their flashlights to navigate through the maze of old storage rooms and utility areas. In one room, they found a heavy metal door, partially ajar. The door was rusted and looked ancient. "What's in here?" Laura asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. Jake pushed the door open, revealing a small, dark room. The walls were lined with shelves full of dusty old files and medical records. In the center of the room was a solitary chair, its straps worn and frayed. It was unmistakably an old restraint chair, used for patients deemed too difficult to manage. Emily shivered. "This place is seriously messed up." They began sifting through the files, most of them illegible or too damaged to read. But one folder in particular caught Jake's eye. It was labeled Margaret Sullivan, Last Treatment. The folder was surprisingly well preserved. Inside were detailed notes about Margaret Sullivan's treatment, including disturbing descriptions of experimental procedures and electroshock therapy. The final entry was dated just days before the asylum was closed. Jake read aloud, his voice faltering. Margaret Sullivan's condition has worsened. The patient exhibits extreme agitation and paranoia. Recommended immediate isolation and increased dosage of medication. As he read, the room grew colder and a heavy silence fell over them. They could feel a shift in the air, an oppressive presence that seemed to press in from all sides. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the basement, making them all jump. The metal door they had entered through slammed shut, and the lights flickered. The temperature dropped further, and their breath became visible. What the hell was that? Sam shouted. The others looked around, their faces pale with fear. Emily tried the door, but it was firmly shut. They were trapped from the darkness. A low, mournful wail began to echo through the basement. It grew louder, filling the space with an almost tangible despair. The sound seemed to come from all directions, converging on the small room they were in. Jake, his voice trembling, tried to stay calm. We need to find another way out. There must be an emergency exit or something. They searched frantically, but the basement was a maze of dark, empty rooms. The wail grew louder, more desperate, and was now accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps moving toward them. It was as though someone or something was approaching, getting closer with each passing second. The footsteps were now right outside their room. They could hear them clearly, heavy and deliberate. The door to the room began to rattle, as if someone was trying to get in. Please, let us out. Laura screamed, her voice breaking. In a final act of desperation, Emily threw herself against the door, hoping to force it open. Just as she did, the door suddenly swung open on its own, and the wailing stopped abruptly. They stumbled into the basement hallway, their flashlights flickering as they made their way back to the staircase. The oppressive presence seemed to follow them, a shadow moving just out of sight. They reached the top of the stairs and bolted out of the asylum, not stopping until they were back in their car, the headlights casting long shadows over the crumbling structure behind them. As they drove away, the silence in the car was palpable. They looked back at the Forsyth Asylum, its dark windows staring back at them. They never spoke of that night again, but they knew they had encountered something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The Forsyth Asylum remained abandoned, its dark secrets hidden behind the rotting walls. And in the depths of its forgotten rooms, the echoes of Margaret Sullivan's torment still lingered, waiting for the next visitors to uncover its horrors. Blackwood Manor was a grand estate that had long been the pride of the region. With its Gothic architecture, sprawling gardens, and ancient oak trees, it was the epitome of old-world charm. But the manor had been abandoned for decades, and the stories surrounding it had grown darker with each passing year. When Amelia and her friends Mark, Tina, and Josh heard about the manor, they saw it as the ultimate challenge for their weekend exploration. They were thrill-seekers, always looking for the next big adventure, and Blackwood Manor promised just that. They arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the overgrown grounds. The manor's towering spires and ivy-clad walls loomed ahead, exuding an aura of faded grandeur and neglect. As they approached the front entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open with an eerie groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Their footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the grandeur of the past mingling with the grim reality of abandonment. The group split up to explore different parts of the manor. Amelia and Mark headed toward the library, while Tina and Josh made their way to the ballroom. The library was a cavernous room lined with bookshelves, most of them empty or covered in cobwebs. In the center of the room was a large, ornate fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. Amelia was flipping through a dusty old book when Mark's voice called out from the back of the room, "Hey, check this out." Amelia turned to see Mark standing in front of a large, dusty portrait. The painting depicted a stern-looking man in Victorian attire, his eyes seeming to follow them with an unsettling intensity. "Who was he?" Amelia asked, her voice echoing in the vast room. Mark examined the frame, which was intricately carved with the name Lord Alistair Blackwood. He must be the original owner of the manor. The atmosphere in the library grew heavier, the air growing colder as they studied the portrait. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if the eyes in the painting were watching their every move. Meanwhile, Tina and Josh explored the ballroom, which was as grand as it was eerie. The room was decorated with faded wallpaper, and the once opulent chandeliers hung low, their crystals catching the dim light from their flashlights. "This place is incredible," Tina said, running her hand over the dust-covered grand piano. "Imagine the parties that were held here." Josh nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As they moved toward a set of double doors leading to an adjacent room, Tina noticed a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. "Check out this mirror," Tina said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's gorgeous." Josh looked at the mirror, its surface dark and reflective. "Yeah, it's amazing. Double quotes. As they admired the mirror, Tina noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror showed not only the ballroom, but also a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. "Did you see that?" Tina asked, her voice trembling. Josh frowned. "See what?" "I swear I saw someone in the reflection," Tina said, her eyes darting around the room. Josh brushed it off as a trick of the light. "It's probably just our imagination back in the library." Amelia and Mark continued to study the portrait. Mark noticed that the eyes of Lord Alistair seemed to follow their every movement. "Is it just me, or do those eyes look like they're moving?" Mark asked. Amelia shivered. "I noticed that too. It's creepy." They decided to leave the library and reunite with Tina and Josh. As they made their way through the manor, they noticed that the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the silence grew heavier. When they arrived in the ballroom, they found Tina and Josh standing near the mirror, their faces pale. "What's wrong?" Amelia asked, concern in her voice. Tina explained what she had seen in the mirror, and Josh added, "I thought I heard something in the other room." It sounded like footsteps. The group decided to investigate further, moving cautiously toward the room beyond the ballroom. As they opened the double doors, they were met with a sight that made their blood run cold. The room was lined with old, dusty furniture and more portraits, but one painting stood out, a portrait of a young woman with a hauntingly familiar face. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and her expression was one of quiet despair. "Who is she?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tina's eyes widened as she recognized something in the portrait. "She looks like the woman in the mirror." Amelia studied the painting closely. "This is strange. I don't remember seeing her anywhere else." As they continued to examine the room, they noticed a small door in the corner. It was slightly ajar, and the air around it felt colder. With a sense of trepidation, they pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. "Do we really want to go down there?" Josh asked, his voice trembling. "We have to," Amelia said, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "We need to find out what's going on." They descended the staircase, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over them. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a hidden cellar, filled with old crates and dusty artifacts. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, and it was locked with a heavy iron padlock. Amelia approached the chest, her heart pounding. "What do you think is inside?" Tina asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Amelia examined the chest and noticed a strange inscription carved into the wood. It read, "To find the truth, one must face the past." Mark tried to open the chest, but it was locked tight. As he struggled with the padlock, a low, mournful wail echoed through the cellar, making them all freeze. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to grow darker. The wailing grew louder, and a ghostly figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was the same woman from the portrait, her face twisted in sorrow. "Who are you?" Amelia shouted, her voice filled with fear. The figure extended a hand toward the chest, her eyes pleading. The wail grew louder, becoming almost unbearable. Without another word, Mark managed to pry open the padlock. The chest creaked open, revealing a collection of old letters and documents. At the top of the pile was a letter addressed to Lord Alistair Blackwood. Amelia carefully unfolded the letter, her hands shaking. The letter was a desperate plea from a woman named Eleanor, who had once been Lord Alistair's wife. The letter spoke of betrayal and a tragic end, revealing that Eleanor had been wrongfully accused and imprisoned in the manor's cellar, where she had died in anguish. As Amelia read the final lines, the wailing ceased, and the ghostly figure of Eleanor slowly faded away. The temperature in the cellar began to rise, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The group emerged from the manor, shaken but relieved. They knew they had uncovered a dark secret from the past, and the spirit of Eleanor could finally find peace. Blackwood Manor stood silent once more, its secrets exposed, waiting for the next visitor to uncover its haunting history. Elm Street was known for its quaint houses and tree-lined streets, a picture-perfect neighborhood where nothing ever seemed out of place. That's why when the old Harris house came up for sale, no one expected it to stir up much excitement. It was a classic Victorian home, charming but slightly worn around the edges. The local gossip mill had little to say about it until the Matthews family moved in. Chris Matthews, a successful businessman, had bought the house with his wife, Laura, and their 2 children, Jake and Emily. They were thrilled about their new home, looking forward to settling into the peaceful life of Elm Street. However, their excitement soon turned to unease. The problems began subtly. Doors would creak open by themselves, lights would flicker, and shadows seemed to move on their own. At first, they chalked it up to the house's age. Old homes have quirks, they told themselves. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the attic, Laura discovered a collection of old photographs hidden in a dusty trunk. The photos depicted a family from the early 1900s, and among them was a portrait of a stern-looking man. His gaze seemed unsettlingly intense, as though he were watching them even from the photograph. That night, Chris was woken by a strange noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. The sound was faint, but persistent. He dismissed it as the house settling and went back to sleep. But the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. The next day, Laura found an old diary among the attic's forgotten relics. The diary belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Harris, who had lived in the house with her husband, the man from the photographs. The entries spoke of a happy life, until one entry stood out. "He's getting worse. I fear for my safety." As Laura read further, she discovered that Elizabeth had written about her husband's growing paranoia and abusive behavior. The last entry was a frantic plea for help, revealing that Elizabeth had vanished without a trace. That night, the disturbances intensified. Jake and Emily heard whispers in their rooms, and objects began to move on their own. The Matthews family was on edge, their excitement for their new home turning to dread. Chris decided to investigate the house's history and discovered that Elizabeth Harris had never been found. The authorities had assumed she had left or been murdered, but her fate remained a mystery. Determined to get to the bottom of the haunting, the Matthews family sought out a local historian, Mrs. Thompson, who had spent years researching the history of Elm Street. She agreed to help them, intrigued by the case. Mrs. Thompson arrived at the house with a collection of old maps and documents. She explained that the Harris family had been prominent figures in the neighborhood, but the husband, Thomas Harris, had been known for his erratic behavior and cruel treatment of his wife. He was rumored to have been involved in dark practices, seeking to control and dominate those around him. As Mrs. Thompson pieced together the history, the family's fears grew. The disturbances in the house seemed to coincide with the dates Elizabeth had written about in her diary. It was clear that whatever happened to Elizabeth was still affecting the house. One evening, as they researched, the tapping noise started again, louder and more frantic than before. The temperature in the house dropped suddenly, and a chilling draft swept through the rooms. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air was filled with a sense of impending doom. Laura, desperate for answers, spoke to the spirit she believed was Elizabeth. "We want to help you. Please tell us what happened." In response, the lights flickered, and a ghostly figure appeared in the hallway, a woman in period clothing, her face filled with sorrow. It was Elizabeth Harris. Elizabeth's spirit seemed to communicate through a series of flickers and movements, guiding them to the basement. The family followed, their hearts racing. In the dim light of their flashlights, they found a hidden door behind a large old furnace. Chris forced the door open, revealing a small, hidden room. Inside was a small, dusty bed and a few personal items, a testament to the room's use as a secret confinement space. Laura's heart sank as she found a hidden compartment under the bed. Inside were Elizabeth's final writings, a confession of how she had been trapped and abused by Thomas. The writings detailed a desperate plea for release and an indication that Thomas had hidden her body somewhere on the property. With Mrs. Thompson's help, they contacted the authorities, and a search of the grounds was conducted. They found Elizabeth's remains buried in a shallow grave behind the house. The discovery brought closure to Elizabeth's spirit, and the disturbances in the house began to subside. The Matthews family, though shaken by the events, felt a sense of relief knowing they had helped bring peace to a tormented soul. As they settled into their new home, Elm Street returned to its quiet, picturesque charm. The Harris house stood as a reminder of its dark past, but now it was a place of healing and a testament to the power of uncovering the truth. In the small town of Greenwood, the Whispering Pines Cemetery was known for its eerie atmosphere and strange occurrences. Located on the outskirts of town, the cemetery was shrouded in mist and shadow, with ancient tombstones and twisted trees that seemed to whisper secrets to those who ventured too close. When a group of friends, Sarah, Alex, Emily, and Daniel, heard about the cemetery's reputation, they were intrigued. They were avid paranormal enthusiasts, always on the lookout for their next adventure. The stories about Whispering Pines, with its tales of ghostly apparitions and strange noises, were too tempting to resist. One foggy evening, they set out to explore the cemetery. The air was damp and cold, and the fog rolled in thick, obscuring their view. The group entered through the rusted iron gates, their flashlights piercing through the darkness. As they wandered among the graves, the atmosphere grew heavier. The old tombstones, many of them worn and illegible, seemed to lean toward them, casting long shadows. The trees, their branches gnarled and twisted, seemed to whisper on the wind. "This place is creepy," Emily said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I've read that people hear voices and see strange lights here," Alex said, adjusting his flashlight. "Let's see if we can capture something on camera." They set up their equipment, a video camera, audio recorder, and a few infrared sensors, hoping to document any paranormal activity. As they worked, Sarah noticed a particular gravestone that seemed different from the rest. It was unusually well maintained, with fresh flowers placed beside it and a neatly carved inscription. The gravestone read, "In memory of Eleanor Blackwood, beloved wife and mother." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. This is odd. The name Blackwood, like the Blackwood Manor we explored last month. The group gathered around the grave, their curiosity piqued. As they examined the site, the temperature seemed to drop sharply, and a faint mournful wail began to fill the air. Emily looked around nervously. "I think we should get out of here. This place feels wrong." But before they could leave, Alex's camera caught something on film, a shadowy figure moving among the graves. It was indistinct, but seemed to be drifting toward them. "Did anyone else see that?" Alex asked, his voice tense. Daniel, who had been scanning the area with a thermal camera, nodded. "There's something here. The temperature is fluctuating wildly." As the group continued to investigate, they noticed that the whispering sounds grew louder, almost like murmurs and whispers blending together. The air was thick with an oppressive presence, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Suddenly, Sarah saw something in the distance, a figure standing near a large oak tree. It was a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by the fog. She appeared to be weeping, her figure flickering in and out of view. "Guys, look over there." Sarah pointed. The group moved cautiously toward the figure, their hearts racing. As they got closer, the woman's form became clearer. She looked mournful, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Who are you?" Sarah called out. The woman's voice was barely a whisper, but it was clear. "Help me. I am trapped." The group was stunned. They could barely hear her over the rising wind and the growing intensity of the whispers. "How can we help you?" Alex asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman pointed toward the gravestone of Eleanor Blackwood. "Find the truth. Release me." With that, her figure dissolved into the mist, leaving the friends in stunned silence. Determined to uncover the mystery, they returned to the gravestone and dug around the base, finding a hidden compartment buried beneath it. Inside, they discovered a collection of old letters and documents, all related to Eleanor Blackwood. The letters detailed Eleanor's tragic life, revealing that she had been wrongfully accused of witchcraft by her husband, who had been a powerful figure in the town. Eleanor had been condemned and buried alive in the cemetery, her cries for help ignored. The final letter was a desperate plea for someone to find her remains and give her a proper burial. Overwhelmed with empathy, the group contacted local authorities and historical societies, providing them with the evidence they had found. The cemetery was officially excavated, and Eleanor's remains were discovered and given a dignified reburial. The haunting of Whispering Pines Cemetery ceased after Eleanor's remains were laid to rest properly. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the whispers in the wind became a gentle breeze. The friends left Greenwood with a sense of accomplishment, knowing they had helped bring peace to a tormented soul. The cemetery became known not just for its eerie reputation, but for the story of Eleanor Blackwood, whose tragic fate had finally been resolved. Whispering Pines returned to its quiet, misty charm, a testament to the power of uncovering and addressing the past.